Hello and welcome to the Sabrina River Folk Podcast with me, Nicola Haasz. Tonight's guest is a living legend, Witts of Gloucester. This is the very first Sabrina River Folk Podcast, and it was actually Chris that inspired me to finally take a leap of faith and create it. So it feels really special that he is my first guest on the show. Chris has spent a lifetime on the Severn and in his later years became a historian, a YouTuber, a speaker at many local history societies. He's appeared on TV and radio and written lots of books on the subject. How many have you written now, Chris?
Oh, I don't know, because I've written a lot of e-books as well, so I've lost count. Quite a lot.
So welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you.
We last met at the talk that you gave at Slimbridge Local History Society at Slimbridge Village Hall, and I remember very vividly that night. It was a very stormy night. It was raining. It was cold. It was dark and dreary, and I was determined to come along to the talk. And I think with these type of things, you never know what to expect. And when we got there, we were quite shocked because I think if anyone's ever in doubt about how much Severnsiders love their river, I think you said at the end that you anticipated maybe there might be 6, 7 members at the talk. But actually I think there must have been over 100 people there.
Yeah. Standing room only.
Yeah, it was packed to the rafters. And I do think that's a reflection of you as a speaker and your draw for people, but also people's love for our beloved River Severn as well. And Slimbridge is obviously very close proximity to the river, famous for the wetlands there. And people were enraptured by your talk. And I think that we can go over some of that material in this podcast this evening. So really, if we can begin at the beginning, as they say, a little bit of an introduction, of yourself and where life began for you, how, your history, that sort of thing.
Right. Well, I'm Bristol born, and I came to Gloucester when I was 7 years of age. So I classed myself as a Gloucester lad as well. And my education wasn't the best. I was bottom of the class every year. I still got my school reports right through secondary school, and each one says number in class 30, position in class 30, could do better. I had that every year, and I'm quite proud of it now, because as soon as I left school, I took off, and I've never stopped learning. But in those early days, when I left school at the age of 16, it was just more or less on my 16th birthday I left school in the summer of 1960. And I got myself a job as deckhand with a company called John Harker Limited, who ran tanker barges on the Severn and down the Bristol Channel. And the reason I got the job, or thought of that job, was that this school I went to, this secondary school, was mad on rugby, and I hated the game. I never got picked. I hated it. So in my last year at school, from 15, I used to bunk off, instead of playing rugby, go through a hole in the hedge and go down to Gloucester Docks, where I saw these tankers going through with these lads on. And that's when the day after I left school, I went down to the company office in Gloucester Docks and asked for a job. And I got myself a job as deckhand at 16 on one of the tankers. And another reason for my passion on the Severn is that at the age of 14, my mother bought me a book about the River Severn, and which I still got, and I still refer to it, and it's one of my favourite books. I was hooked on the Severn. Going right forward to these the last few years, I've tried to get interested in other British rivers. I can't. I can't. It's the Severn draws me back. So I now I just think about the Severn.
Amazing. And what book was that? What book did your mum buy you?
Uh, it's in front of me now, somewhere along the way. I've got practically every book written on the Severn
I think
is
I
on
do as
my
well.
bookshelf, and I can't quite see that book. Um, I've forgotten the name of the author. Brian Waters, I think, was the name of the author.
Yeah,
He wrote a series of books,
yeah.
but it was
I've
one
got
of
those
those,
as well. Yeah.
and I was just hooked on it. In actual fact, when I left Harker's and went to work in Bridgewater for a month, I still refer to that book because it covered Bridgewater as well. So yeah,
And those early days when you were on the barges on the Severn, what kind of life was that like? Was it quite a dangerous profession to have?
it was so dangerous. Um, for a lad like me, I was a quiet lad, not an extrovert, more of an introvert. And my parents, unknown to me at that time, were shocked that I'd got myself this job. And a month into the job, and I never learned this until after I left. My father went to see the manager, who happened to live only a half a mile from where we lived at Gloucester. He went to see him and said, I am concerned about my son working for your company. And the manager said, you've every right to be concerned. It's a dangerous, hard job, but let him work it out of his system for a month. And I would then take him on as an apprentice in the shipyard they also ran in Gloucester Docks. But I never got it out of my system. I stayed there through thick and thin in that job for a number of years.
And can you give us an idea of what a day like would have been for you working on the barges in those days?
Well, it was a four-man crew: skipper, mate, engineer, and lad. And from day one, I was told you only speak when you're spoken to, because that's how it was in those days. You don't speak out of turn. Um, and we used to spend about 6 weeks at a time down the Bristol Channel working all the tides. And there's only four of us, so we had to do what we call two up and two down. That was two sleeping and two working. But the majority of the time, it was all four of us working in and out of the different ports. But you couldn't name a day by the time, because each day at a different time was different because of the tides changing, etc. But my job on these tankers, I was the cook. I had to cook 3 square meals a day: cook breakfast, cook lunch, and cook evening meal. That was my job, to cook. My job was to paint as well, paint the vessel keeper up, clean the accommodation, and the accommodation was second to none. Each of the four of us had our own cabin, and they were cozy, central heated, little carpet. I had portholes to look out of, two portholes, nice bunk, settee, cover space. It was a cozy little cabin, and there was each one had one. We had a nice mess room, toilet facilities, a galley. It was our home, and I had to keep that in extra cleanliness. I mean, the skipper would come and inspect, and we had ridged like whitey cream tiles, clay tiles on the galley floor on the deck, and they had to be spotless, not a bit of dirt, and that's how it was. So I was just luckily I was brought up in that same environment in a way. So when I went to work doing this, it came natural. And then we had to take turns steering as well. I didn't do a lot of steering because the mates and the skipper shared the steering. Um, we never referred to a chart. It was crazy. Unfortunately, being a dangerous job, there were several accidents where men were killed. That was the problem.
And what were you transporting and where from and to?
Right, we were an interesting route. We were based in Gloucester Docks, and a typical day, say we'd had a night at home, which was a rarity, a total rarity, but say we had, and we could be leaving Gloucester Docks at 6 o'clock in the morning, 3 hours down the Gloucester and Sharpness Canal to Sharpness, 3 hours. Um, you'll be waiting around at Sharpness Docks on average about half an hour to get caught into the sea lock, locked down out into the Severn estuary. And if you were bound for Swansea and Avonmouth were our two main loading ports, mainly Swansea. So it was about 10 hours to go down to Swansea. And it depended on the state of the tide, whether we had to lay on the piers outside the lock before the tide time came to lock in, or we could go straight into the lock. It all depended. But we go into this massive sea lock, and then we go up to what the Queen's Dock. Swansea is quite a big port. It had the King's Dock for your normal cargo ships, and the Queen's Dock, which was the petrol terminals. We'd go into the Queen's Dock, which is a long, long dock, and you had ocean-going tankers in there, coastal tankers, and us little craft, and we'd go up to the berth, and we on my vessel, we would be loading mostly petrol, sometimes paraffin, what they call gas oil, which is like a diesel oil, white spirit. That's about it. Then you had a small fleet of black oilers, and they would load this very heavy oil, and they had heating coils going through the cargo tanks to keep it in a liquefied state. If they didn't, the cargo would turn into like a tar. So it was imperative they had boilers. They didn't carry a lad. The black oilers only carried 2 engineers and not a lad, whereas all the petrol boats carried a lad. And it would take us about a couple of hours to load. But the trouble was, the jetty man was used to loading ocean-going tankers, all these coastal tankers, not little stuff like us. And we had to give the jetty man 20 minutes notice of when he had to shut down his valves, because the petrol was coming into the cargo tanks at high pressure. And so it was the mate's job to load us and get all the trim corrected right. And it was a big responsibility for him to keep going up and down the decks to make sure we were trimmed right, and then give this 20 minutes notice. And then we would set off, sometimes back to Gloucester, so the return trip all the way up to Gloucester, but then we would go on up river to Worcester. And when you consider how big we were, this fleet going up to Worcester every day, 7 hours to get to Worcester, 4 hours to pump the cargo out, and then 4 hours to come back down with the current to Gloucester. But if you were delayed or came off tide from Sharpness to go straight through to Worcester, you had to stay in Worcester overnight. And that was the interesting part, because the men went ashore and got drunk. Because it was the only place we stopped. We never stopped down Channel. We were in the Bristol Channel. We were on the go all the time. But Worcester, if you were lucky, we could have a night at Worcester. And the men used to go ashore and say, get drunk.
Yeah, I think that it's often forgotten how vital the pubs and the inns were to the river folk, those that worked on the canals and on the rivers. These places were essential, really, for, those sailing up and down with the tides. And how much did the tide of the Severn, which is obviously very unique, affect how the barges were run?
Quite a lot. I never took much interest of when I was a deckhand. It was in latter years I took the interest in the tides. But below Sharpness, you've got the second highest rise and fall of tide in the world. The Bay of Fundy in Canada being the highest, and the Severn is only an inch or so behind that one. It's a massive rise and fall, which gives vessels getting into Sharpness. It's ever so difficult to get something into Sharpness. Even today, ships have to have pilots. The pilots pick the ships up at Barry and bring them up the 3-hour trip up to Sharpness. Even they today, are only happy when they've got into the lock at Sharpness. It's quite difficult out there. In the days of the tankers, it was the golden rule, rough rule was, if a mate wanted to become a skipper, he had to take a loaded barge from the Severn into Sharpness Docks.
Mm.
And I can remember the mates I worked with. Me, the mate, and the skipper, the three of us were together for a number of years. And we were like a family. We knew each other. We trusted each other. And one day Mike said he wanted to be skipper. So my skipper said, well, here's your chance. Take her into Sharpness. Halfway in doing this, Mike chickened out and said, I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. It's a terrific responsibility. And hence why we've had the disasters like the Severn Bridge disaster of 1960. Although fog was the culprit in that one, it's also the tides as well.
Yeah, I remember you talking about this at Slimbridge talk that you gave. Could you take us to the that night? And because of course you were on the river yourself then when it
Yeah,
happened.
I'd only been with the company working on the craft for about 6 weeks, and it was the 25th of October 1960. I was on the Wysdale H, and at that time, the Wysdale H and the sister vessel, the Wasdale H, they had both been built at Sharpness Shipyard by Harkers, but they were built with a bit of a design fault. They were too low at the front end and at the bow, so we couldn't go down to Swansea. It was too dangerous. So we were what was classed as an Avonmouth to Worcester vessel. So that morning of that day, both us, the Wysdale and the Wasdale, had been down to Avonmouth to load a cargo of petrol each. And we left Avonmouth about 7 o'clock that night, bound for Sharpness. And there was about 14 craft on the river that night, bound for Sharpness, which is quite normal. It's quite a large fleet bound for Sharpness. Tugs, towing lighters, cargo vessels, us on the tankers. And we also, there's another company called the Region Oil Tankers. They had a fleet of small vessels as well, all coming up the river. And me on the Wysdale, at that time, I worked with a bit of a horrible crew. And I made them a hot drink and then went down the accommodation, keep out their way. I thought, out of sight, out of mind. But suddenly, about 9 o'clock, the bell in the accommodation rang, which meant I had to go on deck to see what the skipper wanted. I went up on deck and we were in a thick fog. He yells to me to get up on the bow with a mate and listen for the fog going off Sharpness. And the fog was, I've never been in thick fog like it. You just couldn't see a hand in front of your face. All you could hear was a lapping of water on the hull of the vessel. And suddenly the Wasdale came out of the fog and hit us, but only a glancing blow. They went off, and I said to the lad on there, Malcolm Hart, I said, see you tomorrow, Malcolm. And off they went into the fog. But they got caught up. They missed the entrance to Sharpness Docks. And they ended up at the old dock entrance alongside another vessel which had missed the dock entrance, the Arkandale H. And they lay alongside one another. And George, the skipper on the Arkandale, wasn't too bothered because he said to Jimmy on the Wasdale, don't worry, when it's high water, we'll calmly go down and in. Unfortunately, because they were both laying alongside one another, they couldn't steer them right, and suddenly the fast flowing tide got hold of them and swept them up to the Severn Railway Bridge, and they hit one of the columns, which the Wasdale was on the inside, and as soon as they hit the column, the Wasdale tipped on her side and tipped the crew in the water. The Arkandale's pushing against her. The bridge is shaking. George is in a stupor in the wheelhouse. He looks up and he sees the two spans of the bridge shaking above him, and suddenly they come crashing down across the tank tops. And the Arkandale's carrying black oil, the Wasdale's carrying petrol, and the tanks are ripped apart, there's sparks flying, the petrol ignites, and the cargoes spew out into the Severn, and the Severn's ablaze. Now, we back on the Wysdale heard the explosion, saw this massive ball of fire, and it more or less cleared the fog. So we made a dash for it and got into Sharpness. We all got in safe and sound. And in my naivety, I thought, well, this must happen every day. I just calmly went to my cabin, turned in, and went to sleep. And all this mayhem was going on out in the river. And next morning, going up the canal, you could see the wreck smouldering. And really, after that, it was never spoken about. It just didn't
Right.
get spoken. But the sad part was, in the February of 1961, a few months after that, the BP Explorer turned over, and all 5 crewmen were killed because Harkers had on charter 7 of these, what we call the shell boats, and they were big. They were big and modern, crewed by 5 men. And they say the BP Explorer turned over coming out the river, and they didn't know about it until the day after, when she bounced through the wreck of the bridge upside down, the whole bouncing through. And it was then they realised the BP Explorer was missing. And one by one, they found the 5 men.
Oh, dear. Yeah, and of course there's a memorial to that tragic disaster down at the where the ruins of the railway bridge down at Purton,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a memory of that tragic incident. And so obviously life on the Severn in those barges was incredibly dangerous, and it must have do you look back now and think, gosh, I can't believe that that I did that, and you were quite courageous and brave to live that lifestyle.
No, I don't. I don't. The only thing is that, ironically, my skipper, after this incident, we went into dry dock at Gloucester shipyard to be rebuilt to become a Swansea boat. And the skipper, the mate, and the engineer all left the company. But I stayed on board for 6 weeks painting the accommodation. At the end of that time, the end of the 6 weeks, I'm on deck in the shipyard in the dry dock. And a booming voice comes down, "Hey lad." I look up and he said, "I'm your new skipper." And it was George Thompson, who had been skipper of the Arkindale in the accident. And I cringed because no one liked working with George. He was a hard man, and etc. etc. No one liked working with him. I groaned. But anyway, George became like a dad to me. He turned me from a boy into a man. And I say we stayed together as friends right up until he died in his 80s. And the same with Mike. Mike, the mate, we stayed together. And again, stayed friends all the way through until Mike died only a few years ago. And every year, without fail, George would relate the Severn Railway Bridge accident, word for word, and his part in it. And he never changed his story. Not once did he ever change his story. The only thing was, as he got up towards the last 10 years or so of his life, he used to start crying. He got
Mm.
very emotional, which for me, not so much embarrassing, but I didn't like to see it because George was this hard man and to see him crying. But I find myself now, because now I'm 80 myself, and I find I'm a bit the same. I do tend to get a bit emotional about when I think back to that night and all that. But that's the only thing. That's the only thing. But I mean, I don't think about the story every day. But when I do, and when I go out giving talks, most people won't know how emotional I feel inside because at the moment I can still control it.
Yeah,
But it's there. It's there, like it was with George.
yeah. And if I remember correctly, uh, you after you'd served on these barges as a young man, you took the decision then to go into the fire service.
Yes, that's it. In actual fact, it wasn't straight into the fire service. There is a little bit in between. Sometimes I tell the true story, and sometimes I miss it out altogether. What happened? Um, I was coming up. I was into my 19. I was 19 into that year, like, and it was summertime. And what happened to start this off was that we used to run to Bridgewater quite regular, up the River Parrett to Bridgewater, which again is an awkward river. We had to have a pilot to take us up the river to a village called Dunbar, which is just below Bridgewater Docks as it was then. And we used to unload on these jetties. And oh, that's it. We had to miss a tide or something like that. So it was a chance for us all to go ashore. So all of us, the four of us, we got the bus about 5 o'clock into Bridgewater. And as we're in the centre of Bridgewater, Mike, who used to work on the coal boats out of Bridgewater before he joined Harkers, he saw a friend of his, and we stopped. So there's George talking to his friend with his skipper and engineer, like all joining in. There's me still on the sidelines, as I said, speak when you're spoken to. I'm on the sidelines, and this group of girls come by who happen to be the one, Judith, the cousin of Mike's friend. So anyway, they stop, and I get talking to Judith, and we swapped addresses, like for some reason, like that, swapped addresses, and nothing. Because I don't think I saw her that night. But anyway, a week later, George sent me up to Bridgewater to get some food. I get on the bus and go to Bridgewater, and I saw Judith. And so we basically started courting, and George knew this, so he did his best to let me ashore to see Judith. And
Oh,
then I got a bit fed up working on the tankers doing this, and I wanted to be more with Judith. And Mike said, "Well, go ashore." This was about one lunchtime. Go ashore, and if the vessel they called the Lee Spray carrying coal, we'd be in Bridgewater Docks. He said, "Go aboard and say that Mike sent you and ask for a job." Anyway, so I got on board the Lee Spray, I went down the accommodation. Oh, Christ. They were sat round the mess table, and they had the butter pot open. Butter's got all coal dust on top of it. There was coal dust everywhere. And I looked around, I never even got as far as asking for a job. I said, "Oh, Mike said if I'm up in Bridgewater, the guys come aboard and say hello." And then I cleared off. I went back and I said, "No, Mike." I said, "At least these tankers are spotlessly clean." I said, no. But anyway, I left Harkers, and that's why I went to work in Bridgewater for a month, and and then I got fed up. I came back to Gloucester. I left Judith. We split up, which was a bit sad, but we still email these days. We got back in contact through email and say how times are like. And she's happily married, and I'm happily married, so it's all nice. Like it's nice. It's a nice end to that story. But I came back to Gloucester. I got myself a job at what was the new Wall's ice cream factory. And I did 3 years at Wall's Ice Cream Factory, and I did quite well. I got promoted, and the company wanted to promote me on, but I said I can't stand being inside anymore. So I went and joined Gloucester City Fire Brigade, and I did 27 years in the fire service until I was ill health forced me to retire, and I got myself a job working back on the river. But
yeah, that's right.
the fire service, I never left contact with the river.
No.
Because with Gloucester City, we were down the docks quite often in the Severn, and I never lost contact with the crews. And in actual fact, George left Harker soon after me, and he got himself a skipper's job at Bristol on the big sand dredgers. And I used to go away with him every year on a week on the sand dredgers. So it's good.
So it's nice that you kept that contact through all
Yeah,
of your career. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think you said when you had retired from the fire service, you then went back onto um, the boats at Tewkesbury. Is that right?
that's it. Yep, yep. Um, The old Healings grain mill, which was bought out by Allied Mills, but everyone still refers it as Healings, but Allied Mills bought them out. They ran a fleet of grain barges down to Avonmouth. Well, the tanker trade finished, a lot of the trade finished, including the grain barges that finished. So they're all laid up at Tewkesbury. But the month I came out of the fire service in 1993, a month later, I had a phone call to say from Lionel, the skipper, say they're going to start the grain barges back up. It's on a more or less a freelance basis. I need a mate, he said. I'm going to run the grain barges. I need a mate. Do you want the mate's job? Yeah. He said, we're going to run 2 barges down to sharpness in low grain. Now this is very very practical how a company gets it right. Right, they got two men, two grain barges, and we crew both of them. What we would do, we based ourselves at Gloucester because Lionel lived near to me in Gloucester where I lived, and so we got ourselves sorted out. We got the empty one down to Gloucester. So we set off on day one, 8 o'clock in the morning. We set off from Gloucester to go to Sharpness to load grain. It takes us 2.5, 3 hours to get to Sharpness, 2 hours to load 250 tons of grain, 3 hours to get back to Gloucester, which is about 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon. We then go home. 8 o'clock next morning, we take the loaded grain bars to Tewkesbury. We get to Tewkesbury at midday. We then have sandwiches, our lunch. We then put our kit on the empty grain bars at Tewkesbury, bring her back to Gloucester, and get back to Gloucester again about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then next day to take that one down to Sharpness, load, and back up. So we're doing a shuttle service with these two grain barges. But we didn't work every day, and sometimes you could go. I've been 6 weeks without a cargo because it all depended how often the company wanted this grain. But it suited us fine because Lionel was retired. I was retired at the fire service, so it suited us really good. And I did that for about 2.5 years, and then Lionel suddenly died. But the company called me in the office and said, before he died, Lionel said you're okay to go skipper. So you go skipper and get yourself a mate. And I carried the job on. And that finished about 1997, right about that time. It finished, and all went back on the road again. But then I picked up a dredging contract, annual dredging contract at Gloucester Docks. So I kept my hand in. I went skipper on the mud hoppers. So that's when I started writing books. And I've never
Yeah,
lost
so
touch with the river. No.
yeah, because obviously now you run a really great website. You've got a fantastic YouTube channel where you record lots of videos, at Sharpness and at the docks and all sorts of information videos and things, which is absolutely fantastic. So it's clear from the work that you do that you have just such love of the River Severn. Where do you think that comes from?
That book, that no doubt, there's no doubt about it. It's that book of when I was 14. It was, honestly. It's simple as that. And I
Yeah.
said, I can't get interested in any other river. I like rivers, but not to that degree of the Severn. I feel I feel as though the Severn is actually part of me. And the joy of writing the books was that I would travel up and down the river to the source and down to the sea on a regular basis. Because bearing in mind I was a lot younger. I don't do it today, but I was a lot younger, and I travel up and down. And I got to know people right the length of the Severn. The Severn is a very very parochial river. I was talking to people up at the source, and they didn't have a clue what the river was like down this end, and people down this end don't have a clue what it's like at the source, and the same in between. Very, very parochial. Each county has got its own way of doing things. They're all different. Shropshire is totally different to Gloucestershire. When I did a book on all the bridges, and I had to I walked miles along the bank of the Severn, photographing each bridge. And at that time, for me, there was exactly 100 bridges. And so it's easy to call my book A Century of Bridges. And that's changed now. They've added a few, and a few are gone. But I can remember Shropshire. They weren't a fan of public footpaths through the county as such, whereas Gloucestershire and Worcestershire was okay. And I can remember in Shropshire, it was so bad I had to walk along the railway line at one stage
Oh dear.
to get to the bridges. But there you go. I wouldn't do it today, but I mean, I was a lot younger and brave and agile. It was good. I really enjoyed my time of writing these books, and getting the research I did was on the ground as opposed to going to archives. I've never been a lover of archives. One, I don't know how to use the archives, and difficult to read it. I like to feel for it, so I tend to get my facts from talking to people and keep my eyes open.
And where did this the sense of Sabrina come into your life? I know you've written about the legends of Sabrina on your website and things like that, and you've recorded stuff. When did she sort of become part of your psyche on the River Severn?
The thing what did it for me, what made me think more, was there's a statue in a park in Shrewsbury.
Mm.
And last time I was in this park, I couldn't find this blasted statue, but I remember the first time I saw it, it was lovely. It was lovely. But the story really relates farther up the river and into the Welsh borders. It's I don't rate it that much, but the Americans love it. They go wild mad about it. Um, and I've got to say, I think it's all myth anyway. But I mean, it was to do with the kingdoms in those days when Britain was broken up into little regions, Wessex and all that sort of thing, and jealous kings, and it's a good story. I must confess, it's a good story. I'm not very good at relating it from memory, but it does make a good read if you get a good one written. Yeah.
And do you think that the Severn has a goddess, regardless of the mythology? Did you ever get a sense of any kind of protection from the goddess, or people talk about her having moods and having stormy days and other days having really calm
Yeah.
and tranquil days? Did you ever get a sense of that as
Yeah.
you were
Yes. Yes.
actually on
Yes.
the river?
Yeah. Not in the way you say so much, but in my way is that the Severn is a human being. Now
Mm.
you take your box standard human being, boy or girl. Um, we all started as babies, so you've got a baby right up at the source, and I'm going by memory on this one for the areas. A baby up at the source, it comes down through Llanidloes. I don't know if you've ever been to Llanidloes.
Yeah, I've
But
been up to the
above
source.
there, the Severn is basically just a stream.
Yeah.
It gets a bit wider, but it's fast flowing as it gets towards this little first Welsh town of Llanelloys, lovely Welsh market town. And it goes in one side as a bubbling stream, and then comes out the other side as what we know as a river. It's leveled out, the land's leveled out, and it's a river, and it's got wider. So it leaves Llanelloys as this leveling river, and goes on, then flows on down to Newtown, and so on down to us. So when it's around Newtown, it's a child, down a child, and as it goes down through farther down, it's still this child. But when it gets above Gloucester, because Gloucester is a strange part of the Severn, up at, up until it gets to Gloucester, it's changed from a stream to a river and remains a river all the way down to Gloucester, going its normal course. But when it reaches Gloucester, oh boy, does it change. And I say it's like an adolescent, boy or girl, moody. It's really moody, wild, won't do as they're told. And everyone's like, you know what it's like adolescents, they're a pain. And the Severn's like that through Gloucester, because the sort of tides affect the river at Gloucester. Uh, More about that in a second, because that is complicated, but it's worth mentioning the river below Gloucester. But anyway, it's this moody river through Gloucester changing, and as it gets down farther down below Minsterworth and all, a bit farther down there towards Slimbridge, say, it's grown into an adult. So your Severn Estuary is the adult, but it's changes its moods all the way down. Now Gloucester, with the tide sweeps in from the Atlantic all the way up the Bristol Channel, up the Severn Estuary, but you've got your current coming down all the way from the source. Every river's got its current coming down, travelling down, coming down, and Severn's no different. You get your spring tides. Spring tides, nothing to do with the season. Spring tides are because they spring up high, That's what a spring tide is. They spring up, and you get unique tides, which are never get very big. They're low tides, and you get those every 2 weeks. The tide changes. The new moon and the full moon, and so that's why the tides change during the course of a month. Anyway, the spring tide brings in these fast flowing tides, and the current's coming down. And when it meets the river coming down the current, it bangs it and it pushes it backwards, and that current is reversed. River flows the opposite way back up the river where it came from, and it creates a Severn bore. Um, the bore wave isn't picked up until Newnham Severn, although the tide's been coming in so fast. You stand at Sharpness in the old dock entrance and watch that tide go past. It's going past fast, and that's what hits that current. And you get the famous Severn bore, where thousands come to watch. Now, this year is not very good. Next year is a poor year. It comes and goes. The big tides. You get your 5-star bore, which thousands go to see, and it can be a damp squib because it might not happen properly. And you can get a 3-star bore where it's magnificent. You can't tell. It's all luck with the bore, but people come from far and wide to see the Severn bore.
And when I spoke to you after your talk at Slimbridge, you said, "Oh, I don't know if I can carry on doing this," and I think I was, Chris, you need to keep going. You need to keep these stories alive. How important do you think it is that we keep the folk history of the River Severn history alive? How important do you think it is to tell these stories all the way up and down the whole of the Severn, as you say, through all the different counties and all the different lives and people that live on the Severn? Do you think it's important that we continue to tell this folk knowledge, these
Yeah,
traditions?
it's very important. I've got several worries, but the big worry is you were right at the talk at Slimbridge to say carry on, and other people said the same thing. And I used to go out giving talks, sometimes giving talks every week, 3 times a day. Sometimes I give them talks, and I loved it. But then again, I was young and energetic. I'd go out giving these talks and get so passionate. Um, I'm very picky these days of where I go to give a talk. Now, following the talk at Slimbridge, it was last Friday night. I was booked to go down to Chipping Sodbury, which I did. I had a horrendous journey down there. Horrendous. It was terrible. And a Friday night on the motorway was running fast and loads of traffic. And then it was the road down to Chipping Sodbury, and they were going to close off one of the large village, small town, I can't remember what it's called now. They were going to close it off minutes after I'd gone through. So I had to find another way home. And that was horrendous. But given the talk itself, I gave a completely different talk. I didn't give a talk on the Severn, totally different talk, but I loved it. And I booked, then a lady phoned up the other night for me to give a talk down near Slimbridge. And I said, yeah, I will. I will. It's very important because I'm one of the last surviving people who worked on the river during the tanker era and all that. And now I get annoyed because I listen to the local radio a lot and local papers. And you get, it's horrible to say this, but you get young people who relate a story what I'm telling you now, but it's nowhere near the truth. Nowhere near the truth. And I think, this is terrible. It's terrible because when I'm gone, I'll be forgotten. And then the young people will tell their story, which is not how it happened. And people listening to will believe it. And that's why in 100 years' time, the story will be perhaps nothing like the truth. And that's what worries me about history. How can we trust history? Because it changes and changes and changes.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you're doing what you're doing. And part of the reason I wanted to create a podcast was to capture some of the authentic history of the River Severn. And I really appreciate you contributing to this, because this is exactly what I'm trying to achieve, and to have those voices of people who've actually been on the river and experienced the river and been involved in the history. And you're part of the history of the River Severn now, with your huge back catalogue of books and all of your appearances and talks. So I'm glad that you're continuing to keep going. And I'm really grateful for
Well,
you taking the time to be here today.
I think we have to remember that up until my father's time, well, you could say, I don't know how many hundred years, 200 or 300 years before him, nothing much changed with life,
No.
except for someone invented the television, radio, and an aircraft. But apart from that, nothing much changed. My day-to-day living with my parents was no different to what my dad with his parents, and so on back. But suddenly, and my two sons, nothing much changed for them except their children. That's when it changed. It just went bang. And we've now, everyone relies on computers. AI now, AI is everywhere, isn't it? People rely on AI. I think that's nothing much different to a robot. So what does it come into? I'd love to come back in 100 years and see what happens in the next 100 years. But I think life's wonderful, but it's changing so fast now.
And I think it's important to keep the connection with our natural landscape and with our heritage and with our traditions and with the River Severn. And I think that that's a lot of people have forgotten about that, and we need to bring back that connection to that, to our local rivers. And well, obviously, with all the pollution and things that we know are happening at the moment, all of this is very current. It's very in the society's consciousness right now. And I think that if we bring back the traditions of the river, people will start to remember the traditions and start to care about the river again, and not be in their phones all the
I
time.
know, I know. It is a worry that there's no commercial river traffic on the Severn now, apart from a hotel boat, etc. But there's no cargo carrying craft on the River Severn, which is a worry because that's for the first time that's happened. Up until now, there's always been craft on the River Severn. Right back to early kings, there was craft bringing wine from Bristol, for instance. There was always something, but now there's nothing. So what's going to happen? Is that we're just going to let the river die and not be used commercially as it could be? I don't know. Don't know.
We'll have to
Big
keep,
worry.
yeah, it worries me too. Um, so let's keep these stories alive. Let's keep plodding on, and
Yeah,
we'll keep the traditions going. So really appreciate you joining me, Chris, and thank
yeah.
you very much.
Right. Thanks you, Nikki. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. What's that? It's nine an hour, and it's not bad. It's not been bad.
Many thanks to Chris for joining me this evening. You can find him on his website, www.severntales.co.uk, on YouTube at Chris Witts of Severn Tales, with over 200 videos on the Severn, and his books are available on Amazon.